Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Playing with Power will be at MagicCon Las Vegas this weekend. We are also excited to announce another attendee at MagicCon this weekend. Introducing Commander Buddies, brought to you by Deckmates. Commander Buddies, officially licensed by Wizards of the Coast, are an exciting new way to display your commander in the command zone that's fun and unique. This Commander Buddy features our favorite off-course homunculus, Fblthp, atop of fun and detailed Lost and Found. Commander Buddies are not just a decorative display to be put on top of a shelf. These are a great way to display your commander in the command zone and a fun new expressive way to play the game. These are high quality detailed displays that just ooze with flavor. But these aren't just displays for your commander. You can track your life total, commander tax, commander damage, poison, and anything else you want with the dials on the base of the display. These are only available exclusively at MagicCon Vegas, so stop by the official Magic booth to pick up yours while you're there. Tonight we have the Topdeckers, our special guests for this evening. The Topdeckers are a YouTube channel showcasing CEDH gameplay. They also host amazing local CEDH tournaments in their area. Check out the links in the description and support them today. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First we have Ryan, piloting Godo, Bandit Warlord. This deck seeks to cast its commander, fetch up Helm of the Host, and win with infinite combats. Next we have Nick, piloting Talion, the Kindly Lord. This deck seeks to control the board, gain lots of advantage, and win with the Thasos Oracle combo. After that we have Joe, piloting the partner pair of Dargo the Shipwrecker and Thrasios Triton Hero. This deck uses Dargo as a combo piece to either generate infinite mana or draw a ton of cards. It then draws its deck with Thrasios and wins with combat. Finally we have Bailey, piloting Inalla, Archmage Ritualist. This deck seeks to cast and copy Spellseeker, then use that to pull together an intricate line to win the game. This video would not be possible without the support of all of our sponsors, including viewers like you on Patreon. If you want to support this content, be sure to check out the links below. You can also support us for free by liking the video and subscribing to our channel if you're not already subscribed. Without further ado, let's kick off this rocky, roaring, robust Ricochet. Joe won the Vacuum Challenge and gets to start us off. Joe draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal and passes. Bailey draws and plays a Surprising Scary into play tapped. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Basalt Monolith. Ryan ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, Joe pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Remora. The table cheers, and Nick ships the turn to Joe. Joe draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Thrasios Triton Hero. Joe ends his turn. Bailey draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. Bailey ends his turn. During its upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts the One Ring. It enters and Ryan gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a burn encounter and drawing a card. Ryan passes to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Talion, the Kindly Lord. Talion enters and Nick names 2. Nick ends his turn. Joe draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts Birds of Paradise. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Cyclonic Rift, which is what he tutored for. Joe ships the turn to Bailey. At the end of Joe's turn, Bailey cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Tainted Pact. Talion triggers and Bailey loses 2 life and Joe draws a card. Pact resolves and Bailey exiles from the top of his library until he exiles ad nauseum, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Bailey. Bailey draws and plays a Peat Bog into play tapped. He casts Phantasmal Image. Talion triggers, Bailey loses 2 life, and Nick draws. Image enters as a copy of Talion, and Bailey names 2 as it enters. He casts a Windfall. Each player discards their hand and draws 6. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Demonic Tutor. Talion triggers, Bailey loses 2, and Nick draws. Then Bailey fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Animate Dead. Talion triggers, Bailey loses 2, and Nick draws a card. Animate Dead enters and reanimates Ryan's Dockside in his graveyard. Dockside triggers and Bailey creates 4 treasures. He casts Time Twister. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their libraries and draws 7. With nothing else, Bailey passes to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses a life to the One Ring, then loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain for turn. He casts a Manifold Key. In response, Joe casts a Braid, targeting Basalt Monolith. Both Talions trigger, Joe loses 4, and Nick and Bailey draw. In response, Ryan activates Basalt, floating 3 colorless. Then Basalt is destroyed and Manifold Key resolves. Ryan activates Manifold Key, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Voltaic Key. He activates Voltaic Key, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 4 cards. He casts Defense Grid. 2 Talions trigger, Ryan loses 4, and Nick and Bailey draw. In response, Nick casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Defense Grid is countered, and Ryan creates 2 treasures. Next, Ryan casts Final Fortune. 2 Talions trigger, Ryan loses 4, and Nick and Bailey draw. Ryan moves to his next turn, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Ryan loses 4 life to the One Ring and wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 5 cards. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain for turn. He casts Mind Goblin. 2 Talion's trigger, Ryan loses 4, and Nick and Bailey draw. Mind Goblin enters, Ryan adds a Delusionary sticker, adding 6 red. Ryan activates Voltaic Key, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 6 cards. He activates Manifold Key, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 7 cards. He casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Helm of the Host onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Ball. He activates Helm of the Host, targeting Godo. In response, Joe casts Deflecting Swat, targeting the ability. He changes the target of Helm to Ryan's Delusionary Goblin. With the equip ability still in the stack, Ryan casts his own Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting the ability. Swat resolves, changing the equip target back to Godo. Ryan attempts to move through phases, and in response, Bailey casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Helm. In response, Ryan casts Pyroblast, targeting Chain of Vapor. Chain of Vapor is countered, and Ryan moves to combat. Helm triggers, creating a copy of Godo. Ryan presents a loop of attacking with his hasty Godo copy, getting an extra combat, and creating another Godo through Helm. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Ryan wins the game. Bailey draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Bailey casts Mox Diamond, discarding Scalding Tarn. Bailey passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mox Opal and passes to Nick. Nick draws and plays an Underground River. He casts a Mana Vault. Nick ends his turn. Joe draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Joe creates 4 treasures. He casts the One Ring. It enters, and Joe gains protection from everything. Joe activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. Joe ships the turn to Bailey. Bailey draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Archaeomancer. It enters, and Inalla and Archaeomancer trigger. Bailey returns Dark Ritual to his hand, then Bailey taps City of Brass to pay 1 to Inalla to create a copy of Archaeomancer. It enters, and Bailey returns Wheel of Fortune to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Archaeomancer. Ryan takes it, and Bailey ends his turn, sacrificing the Archaeomancer copy. Ryan draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Humid as it enters. He casts a Grim Monolith. Ryan passes. Nick draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Talisman of Dominance. He taps Underground River to help cast his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. Talion enters, and Nick names 2. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Joe loses a life to the One Ring. He draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts Phantasmal Image. Talion triggers, Joe loses 2 life, and Nick draws a card. Phantasmal Image enters as a copy of Dockside, and Joe creates 6 treasures. He casts Arcane Signet. Talion triggers, Joe loses 2, and Nick draws. He casts Rhystic Study. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Talion triggers, Joe loses 2, and Nick draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Dockside. Ryan takes it, and Joe ends his turn. Bailey draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and Joe draws a card. Then Bailey adds 3 black. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Rhystic triggers, and Joe draws again. Then each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. Next, Bailey taps his City of Brass to help cast Phantasmal Image. Talion and Rhystic trigger, Joe draws, then Bailey loses 2 life, and Nick draws. Image enters as a copy of Dockside, and Bailey creates 7 treasures. He casts Gamble, paying for Rhystic. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Persist. Next, Bailey casts Mnemonic Betrayal, paying for Rhystic. In response, Nick casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card. Rhystic triggers, and Joe draws. In response, Bailey casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Rhystic triggers, and Joe draws again. With nothing else, Force counters Force, and Mnemonic Betrayal resolves. Each opponent exiles their graveyards. He casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, from exile. Talion and Rhystic trigger, Joe draws, and then Bailey loses 2 life, and Nick draws. He casts a Mana Crypt from exile, and Joe draws again. He casts Basalt Monolith from exile, and Joe draws from Rhystic. Bailey taps Basalt for 4 colorless through Kinnan, then untaps it for 3. He adds infinite colorless mana. He casts Ragavan from exile, paying for Rhystic. He casts Birds of Paradise from exile, paying for Rhystic again. He casts Opposition Agent from exile. He casts Phantasmal Image from exile. It enters as a copy of Opposition Agent. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals a bajillion, pumping all of his creatures and giving them haste. He moves to combat, swings with everything, and Bailey wins the game. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Brass Squire. Ryan passes. Nick draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. Nick passes. Joe draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Joe creates 5 treasures. He pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. He sacrifices Mana Crypt to help cast his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. He pays 2 life to help activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Dargo as an additional cost, fetching up a Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. He recasts his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. Tidespout triggers, and Joe bounces Brass Squire back to Ryan's hand. Finished up, Joe passes. Bailey draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He taps City of Brass to help cast a Mystic Remora. Bailey ships the turn. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He recasts Brass Squire and then ends his turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Nick cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. During his upkeep, Nick loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He holds open mana and passes to Joe. Joe draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He dashes out Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Tidespout triggers and Joe returns Dockside to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Bailey with Tidespout and Ragavan and Ryan with Dargo. They both take it, Ragavan triggers, Joe creates a treasure, and Bailey exiles Entomb off of the top of his library. Finished up, Joe passes, returning Ragavan to his hand. During his upkeep, Bailey taps the City of Brass to help pay for his Remora. He draws, plays a Flooded Strand, and passes. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts Hammer of Nazan. Remora triggers and Bailey draws. Hammer enters and Ryan equips it to Brass Squire. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Nick casts Limdul's Vault. Remora triggers and Nick pays for it. In response, Joe casts Swan Song targeting Vault. Tidespout and Remora trigger, Bailey draws, and Joe bounces Brass Squire back to Ryan's hand. Then Swan Song counters Limdul's and Nick creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to Nick. During his upkeep, Nick loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge. He casts his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. Talion enters and Nick chooses 2. Nick passes to Joe. Joe draws and casts Mox Opal. Tidespout and Remora trigger, Bailey draws and Nick bounces Talion to Nick's hand. Joe casts Dockside Extortionist. Tidespout triggers again and Nick bounces Bailey's Mystic Remora. Dockside enters and Joe creates 6 treasures. He casts Ragavan. Tidespout triggers, returning Dockside to his hand. He presents a loop of casting and bouncing Dockside and Ragavan through Tidespout, netting infinite treasures. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios over and over, drawing his deck and putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts all of the creatures in his library. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals a whole bunch. He moves to combat, attacks with his creatures, and Joe wins the game. Nick draws a card for turn and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a turn 1 Mystic Remora. The table sighs and Nick passes. Joe draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora of his own. Remora triggers and Nick draws. Joe passes the turn. Bailey draws and says that he and Ryan should probably play conservatively against 2 Mystic Remora. Ryan neither confirms nor denies, and Bailey plays a Blood Crypt into play tapped. Bailey ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and passes. During his upkeep, Nick pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an island. Nick gives the turn to Joe. During his upkeep, Joe pays to keep his Remora. He draws, plays an Exotic Orchard, and passes the turn. Bailey draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and passes. During his upkeep, Nick pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Clearwater Pathway. He ships the turn to Joe. During his upkeep, Joe pays to keep his Remora. He draws, plays a Spire Garden, and passes. At the end of Joe's turn, Bailey cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. Bailey draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe targeting Joe. Remora triggers and Nick and Joe draw. Then Bailey looks at Joe's hand and draws a card. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. Bailey passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He stares at 2 Remoras and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Nick pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts a Chrome Mox. Remora triggers and Joe draws. Chrome Mox enters and Nick imprints Teferi, Master of Time. Nick passes. During his upkeep, Joe pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Tropical Island. He passes. At the end of Joe's turn, Bailey cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. Bailey draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. Both Remoras trigger and Joe and Nick draw. Bailey ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Command Beacon. Bailey warns him that Nick has enough interaction to stop him, so Ryan decides to do nothing and pass the turn. During his upkeep, Nick finally lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Fairy as it enters. He casts his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. It enters and Nick names 2. Nick passes. During his upkeep, Joe also lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding an island. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Talion triggers, Joe loses 2, and Nick draws. Joe gives the turn to Bailey. Bailey draws and casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts a Windfall. In response, Nick casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling the blue card, countering Windfall. Bailey passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He hard casts Fury. It enters and kills Nick's Talion. Next, Ryan casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Mind Goblin. In response, Nick casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling the Goblin. Ryan passes to Nick. Nick draws and casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Rhystic Study. Nick passes to Joe. At the end of Nick's turn, Joe activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Felwar Stone into his hand. Joe draws and plays a Training Center. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Felwar Stone, paying for Rhystic. He passes. Bailey draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Bailey with Fury. Bailey takes it, and Ryan ships the turn. During his draw step, Nick takes the damage through his mana ball. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He recasts his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. Talion enters, and Nick chooses 2. Nick passes. At the end of Nick's turn, Joe activates Thrasios. In response, Bailey casts Demonic Consultation. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws. Consult resolves, and Bailey names Ad Nauseam. He exiles the top 6, and then exiles, and exiles, and exiles until he finally finds Ad Nauseam, putting it into his hand. Unfortunately, he exiled pretty much all of his win cons. Then Joe's Thrasios resolves, he scries 1, revealing a Tinderwall into his hand. The turn moves to Joe. Joe draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast an Arcane Signet. Talion and Rhystic trigger, Joe pays for Rhystic and then loses 2 life, and Nick draws a card. He casts Tinderwall, paying the Rhystic tax. Joe passes. At the end of Joe's turn, Bailey casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws. Bailey adds 3 black and then casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Nauseam resolves, and Bailey reveals a Lotus Petal, Flusterstorm, Diabolic Intent, Cabal Ritual, Mana Crypt, Rite of Flame, Imperial Seal, Simeon Spirit Guide, Wooded Foothills, City of Brass, Force of Will, Emery Lurker of the Loch, Shallow Grave, Polluted Delta, Talisman of Creativity, Pact of Negation, Gemstone Mine, and a Step Through, deciding to stop there. The turn moves to Bailey. Bailey draws and plays a Gemstone Mine. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws. He activates Witchclaw to see what's left in his library. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives Witchclaw to Joe. He now sees that he has no way to win, so he casts Entomb, paying for Rhystic. He fetches up a Talisman of Dominance into his graveyard. He cycles Unearth, untipting to draw from an empty library, and losing the game. When Bailey dies, Witchclaw leaves the battlefield. The turn moves to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Great Furnace. He casts Heat Shimmer, targeting Fury, paying for Rhystic. In response, Nick casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Fury. Fury dies, and Ryan creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. Then Heat Shimmer fizzles, and Ryan passes the turn. During his draw step, Nick takes the damage through his mana ball. He plays a Morphic Pool for turn. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Nick casts Tainted Pact. Pact resolves, and Nick exiles all but the last 4 of his library, putting Reanimate into his hand. With the trigger on the stack, Joe casts Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting Nick. Rhystic and Talion trigger, Joe loses 2, Nick draws, and then Nick draws off of Rhystic. Then Nick mills the last 2 cards in his library. With Thassa's trigger still on the stack, Joe casts Abrade, targeting Ryan's Mana Crypt. Unfortunately for Nick, Talion triggers. Since it's not an optional trigger, Joe loses 2, and Nick attempts to draw from an empty library, and loses the game. Then Ryan's Mana Crypt is destroyed, and the turn moves to Joe. Joe draws and casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Thrasios as an additional cost. He fetches up a Displacer Kitten onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He taps Ancient Doom to help cast Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 5. Displacer Kitten triggers, and Joe flickers Arcane Signet. Invasion enters under Ryan's control, and Joe fetches up a Seaborn Muse onto the battlefield. He recasts his commander, Thrasios. Joe passes to Ryan. Joe untaps with Ryan through Seedborn. Ryan draws and casts a Hammer of Nazan. In response, Joe activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Scalding Tarn onto the battlefield tap. He taps Ancient Tomb to activate Thrasios again, scrying 1 and revealing a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Then Joe casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Hammer. Ryan ends his turn. Joe draws and cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. He dashes in a Ragavan. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Thrasios, Seedborn, Displacer Kitten, and Ragavan. Ryan blocks Displacer Kitten with his Frizzard. In response, Joe casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Frizzard. Displacer Kitten triggers, and Joe flickers Arcane Signet. Then Frizzard dies, and Ryan takes the rest. Ragavan triggers, Joe creates a treasure, and then Ryan exiles a Gemstone Caverns off of the top of his library. Joe moves to his end step, returns Ragavan to his hand, and the turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. In response, Joe taps Ancient Tomb to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing an Offer You Can't Refuse into his hand. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Twin Flame into his hand. Godo enters, and Ryan fetches up a Helm of the Host onto the battlefield. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Joe activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Llanowar Elves into his hand. Joe draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Burgi, God of Storytelling, into his hand. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. He activates Harnfell, discarding Llanowar Elves, exiling Phantasmal Image, and deflecting SWAT. He activates Harnfell, discarding Dockside, exiling Worldly Tutor, and Dualcaster Mage. Joe casts Twin Flame, targeting Thrasios. Displacer Kitten triggers, and Joe flickers Arcane Signet. With Twin Flame still in the stack, Joe casts Dualcaster Mage from exile. Dualcaster enters, and Joe copies Twin Flame, targeting Dualcaster. He creates infinite copies of Dualcaster Mage. He moves to combat, swings with his Dualcasters, and Joe wins the game. Nick draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Notion Thief. He cracks Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Counterbalance. The table sinks their head, and Nick ends his turn. Joe draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Joe passes. Bailey draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Mystic Remora. Counterbalance triggers, and Nick reveals an Ancient Tomb. Bailey passes. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. Ryan gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. It enters, and Nick names 2. Nick ships the turn. Joe draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Thrasios Triton Hero. Counterbalance and Talion trigger, Joe loses 2, Nick draws, then Nick reveals a Trick Bind through Counterbalance, countering Thrasios. Finished up, Joe passes to Bailey. During his upkeep, Bailey pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He moves to combat and attacks Bailey with Talion. Bailey takes it, and Nick ships the turn to Joe. Joe draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Talion and Counterbalance trigger, Nick reveals a Cyclonic Rift, countering Kinnan, then Joe loses 2, and Nick draws through Talion. Unfortunately caught by Counterbalance again, Joe passes. At the end of Joe's turn, Bailey cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. During his upkeep, Bailey pays to keep his Remora and then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. Bailey passes. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Ryan floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Mana Vault onto the battlefield. He plays a Crystal Vein for turn. Ryan passes. Nick draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He moves to combat and attacks Bailey with Talion. Bailey takes it, and Nick passes. At the end of Nick's turn, Joe cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool into play tapped. Joe draws and casts Mox Amber. Remora and Counterbalance trigger, Bailey draws, then Nick reveals a Swan Song. He casts a Windfall. Remora triggers, and Bailey draws. In response, Nick casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Remora. Remora triggers, and Bailey draws again. Remora bounces, then Windfall resolves. Each player discards their hand and draws 9 cards. Next, Joe plays a Command Tower for turn. He passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Bailey wins his Mana Crypt draw. He draws and casts Mox Opal. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Pyroblast, targeting Counterbalance. Counterbalance triggers, and Nick reveals a Felwar Stone. In response, Nick casts Swan Song. Pyroblast is countered, and Bailey creates a 2/2 bird. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Ryan casts Pyroblast, targeting Counterbalance. Counterbalance triggers, and in response, Nick cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Snow-Covered Island onto the battlefield. He then reveals a Mindbreak Trap. In response, Nick casts Spell Pierce, countering Pyroblast. With Wheel still in the stack, Bailey cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. Then Wheel resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Bailey casts Dockside Extortionist. Talion and Counterbalance trigger, Nick reveals a Dispel, then Bailey loses 2, and Nick draws a card. Dockside enters, and Bailey creates 4 treasures. He casts Demonic Tutor. Talion and Counterbalance trigger, Nick reveals a Takenuma Abandoned Mire, then Bailey loses 2, and Nick draws. Then Bailey fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Cabal Therapy. Counterbalance triggers, and Nick reveals a Verdant Catacombs. In response, Nick casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, since he knows that's what Bailey was going to name in the first place. Trap resolves, and Cabal Therapy is exiled. Next, Bailey taps Mana Confluence to cast a Time Twister. In response, Nick casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, exiling Bailey's Dockside. Then Time Twister resolves, and each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7 cards. Finished up, Bailey passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Felwar Stone. Talion and Counterbalance trigger, Nick reveals a land, then Ryan loses 2 and Nick draws. Ryan passes to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Blood Chief's Ascension. In response, Bailey casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost. Counterbalance triggers, and Nick reveals a land. Blood Chief's Ascension is exiled, and then Nick follows up with a Wishclaw Talisman. He activates it, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ryan. He moves to combat and attacks Bailey with Talion. Bailey blocks with his bird, and Nick ships the turn to Joe. Joe draws and casts Mystical Tutor. Counterbalance triggers, and Nick reveals a Snapcaster Mage. Then Joe fetches up a Snap onto the top of his library. He casts a Windfall. In response, Nick casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Wishclaw Talisman. In response, Ryan casts Ricochet Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Chain of Vapor. Trap resolves, changing the target of Chain of Vapor to Counterbalance. Counterbalance bounces, Nick sacks a land, continues the chain, targeting Wishclaw. Wishclaw bounces, then Windfall resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 6. Next, Joe plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Talion triggers, Joe loses 2, and Nick draws a card. Joe passes the turn. During his upkeep, Bailey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. In response, Joe casts Pyroblast. In response, Bailey casts Pact of Negation. Pact counters Pyroblast, and Betrayal resolves. Each opponent exiles their graveyard. Bailey casts Jezga's Will from exile, targeting Nick, adding 7 red. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond from exile. He casts Wishclaw Talisman from exile. Talion triggers, Bailey loses 2, and Nick draws. He casts Pyroblast from exile, destroying Talion. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Joe. He casts Thassa's Oracle from exile. It enters, and in response, Bailey casts Tainted Pact. He exiles his library, putting the last card into his hand. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Bailey wins the game. The most valuable card in tonight's games, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Talion the Kindly Lord. This card always had an impact whenever it resolved. Drawing cards and draining an opponent's is a powerful ability, and having access to it in the command zone is even better. Thanks again to the Topdeckers for playing in tonight's games. Be sure to check out their content. Links are in the description below. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.